Actually, yes, I got into medical school when I was living in Philly, and decided to move up to Rochester for medical school. So that's
Oh,
where
that's
I
right. Yeah,
did my medical school degree. So I moved from Philly up here. I'll be honest, because living expenses are about half of what they are in Philadelphia and
for
Rochester,
sure.
New York. And that was really the most intimidating part of going to med school, was going from being a functional adult who paid all of her bills to, oh my gosh, I'm about to go into a lot of debt. And so I was very conscious of expenditures and trying to make it as least expensive as possible, which
It seems like you're very conscious of that. Was that a was that a non-negotiable where you're like, I don't care about the money. I really want to do this the rest of my life. Was that something that you had thought of beforehand or maybe regret now?
great question. There are days I have push pulls around this. I do a lot of advising to a lot of medical students, but also some people who are thinking about going to medical school. And I don't think there's an easy or short answer to deciding between like a nurse practitioner or PA route versus the MD route. Because effectively in a lot of healthcare, you can do a lot of really good work as a nurse practitioner or physician assistant in our healthcare system. And actually, at Planned Parenthood, where I work now, I'm actually the only physician on staff, and I oversee 22 mid-level providers or advanced practice clinicians, which kind of is the all-encompassing term for nurse practitioners and PAs. Um, and they're fantastic. They do the vast majority of care across our 9 clinics. And so it's a really tricky decision to make, I think. I was very conscious of how much this was all going to cost, which is why I really considered the nurse practitioner and PA route
Mm.
for a long time, but ultimately felt like I have just a little bit too much of a curious personality, and I was always going to be like, I wish I could go do research, or I wish I could do these other things. So I kind of ended up reasoning to myself that it was worth the additional investment to be able to flex into different spaces down the road in my career. But I don't know. There are days where I go in and sit with my PAs and MPs, and I'm like, oh, I wish I was a PA today. And they
Yeah.
joke with me, and they're like, yeah, it's there are pros and cons to each pathway, I think. And they joke with me all the time that I'll be paying my loans back for longer than they will be, which is true. Which is true.
Yeah, but I
So
think again, like you said, like you did learn. I mean, you do learn a lot in all programs, of course. But I think being a physician, just having that extra knowledge and being curious, I think, is something almost a solution to like learning more is the solution to the curious mind, is what I was saying, and I meant to say. And
yes.
you need a little bit more, just a little bit more. You're like, if you went through all that, maybe inside, although it's going to cost more, like inside, you're like, okay, like I would rather know more than not knowing and being like, oh, so and so will know. Like you'd rather have that knowledge, or at least the answer to the question, right? Because part of when you're doing an interview, I'm assuming when you're doing all your like asking of like finding out a story or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, part of being a doctor is asking the questions, finding out the story, but then also providing solutions, which may, not always be the case if you don't get as much information. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, I think doing that extra route, if you're definitely curious, I think more information may be that solution.
Exactly. And, I find when people say to me, like, what do you think is the big difference between a doc and a mid level? Is I say, I think when things are kind of like, I don't want to use the word straightforward because that's not actually what I mean, but when things are kind of logical, I think my NP and PA colleagues get to the same conclusion I do, probably at the same amount of time. It's when things don't follow the normal patterns and you
Hmm.
really have to go, well, what else could this be, or why is this presenting differently than we commonly see? I find those are the times when I have just a little bit more of a repository of information to go to and go, well, it's not fitting this picture perfectly, but kind of how can we look at this differently? And I think because of the additional, frankly, time that we get to learn all of that stuff, we just have like a deeper well to go to when things aren't exactly straightforward or don't present exactly like you read in the book.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's more of an art form, right? That's why like, yeah, practicing physician, you're practicing always learning something new. And for
Absolutely.
you, when you got into medical school, did you want to go right into the route? Like, did you know that you're going to be Planned Parenthood, or like, what did you start off wanting to pursue?
Great question. I definitely came to medical school with like a totally open mind. I actually spent most of my time in journalism writing sports. I was
Mm.
a big athlete growing up, and I played a lot of soccer. And when I stopped playing soccer in college, there was this like void in my life. So I started writing sports for the newspaper. And so I really had this background in sports. And so I will say, like, when I came to med school, I was like, maybe I'll be an orthopedic surgeon. Like, I know a lot about the knee because I've heard it a bunch, you know? So, and I mean, that really goes to show like I was bringing my personal experience with
Right.
physicians, and really that is the majority of who I've interacted with is orthopedic surgeons at that point in my life. So I definitely thought about that. um, but also I think for me, from the moment I arrived at medical school, I do think I was already conceptualizing of my degree as an opportunity to also be an advocate. And so social justice initiatives have always been an important part of my life. I think I've kind of always been the feisty one out there pushing for change, or, you know, I guess pushing for progressive initiatives. And so I did come to medical school thinking like there is a way to use my medical degree to also push for some of those social justice initiatives that are important kind of to my life in general. And so I always had that lens of social justice too, which early in medical school, I got involved with a few organizations that are considered kind of progressive social justice organizations. The American Medical Student Association, or AMSA, does a lot of advocacy and is thought to be kind of the progressive organization, whereas the AMA, the American Medical Association, is thought to be more of kind of the old stodgy institution. And then I also got involved with Medical Students for Choice, which is an organization that supports abortion and contraception and reproductive health training in medical schools. So I also got involved with that organization, which kind of piqued my interest. I guess from the get-go, was trying to think of like, what are ways that I can use this degree to help serve people who are underserved, or the term I've really enjoyed that I've heard, not enjoyed, but I think is really accurate, that I heard recently is folks who've been purposely ignored, right? Whether
Mm.
that's due to systemic racism or due to stigma of what care they need. Like I always did have this feeling of I want to be able to use this degree to address some of those inadequacies in our society. So those were kind of there, which does not really like work with orthopedic surgery, right? Like those don't really dovetail together.
They're not really in
Um,
the same realm.
exactly. So I think I got into my clinicals in third and fourth year. And basically, I'll tell you, I basically realized I loved everything but the OR. The OR just
Interesting.
wasn't my jam. I just didn't like the operating room. I'm a pretty chatty person and pretty interactive. So I was like, unconscious patients, this is no fun. Like, what am I doing here? I also like lovingly describe myself as a very functional person with like not the longest attention span. In that, you know, some surgeries, man, you're looking at a space this small for hours and hours. And I was like, this is boring. I
Yeah,
want
not
out
for
of
me.
here. I'd much rather, you know, have a really interesting hour-long discussion with someone who's coming in with complaints. So for me, it was clear the only thing I didn't really like was the OR.
Mm.
So I kind of took out orthopedic surgery.
Yep.
Um, and so uh, I then spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what part of medicine do I love? And ultimately concluding, I kind of loved it all. And every time I thought about specializing, I got cold feet. It's the only time in my life that that phrase has ever resonated for me, of getting cold feet. But I'd
Hmm.
think, okay, I'm going to do pediatrics. And then I'd be like, I'm never going to see an adult again. Or I thought about becoming an OBGYN, and I thought, then I'm never going to see a male patient ever again. Like, that's crazy. I
Right.
know so much about male bodies as well. Um, and I also loved neurology. I found neurology totally fascinating. And then I was like, oh, but if I do neurology, like I'm never going to hear about a sprained ankle again. So I just kind of got cold feet and realized I liked having tools to address a lot of different things. So that's when I decided to go into family medicine and really keep my training broad. And I will say that when I was making that decision, becoming an abortion provider was part of the calculation. Abortion care is very underserved in our country. There aren't very many abortion providers, particularly in rural areas, particularly in areas that identify as more conservative or more rural. Um, and so I saw this as a tangible way to affect some social justice change. Just by acquiring the skill set and being able to do that procedure, I was, effectively pushing back against the system and getting to advocate for patients. So being able to provide abortion care was very important to me, which kind of narrowed it down to basically family medicine and OBGYN. And as I mentioned, I didn't like the OR, which my best friend is an OBGYN, and I called and I said, what do you think? What if I do OB, but then just deliver babies and do abortion? And she was like, do not become a surgeon unless you want to become a surgeon, which
Right.
was great advice because she said, you're going to be miserable for half of your residency in the OR. So I ended up going to family medicine, and specifically targeted and picked a family medicine program that I knew would adequately train me to provide abortion care.